Okay, so the practical screen. So coming back to our overall plan. So the first major stage is planning the literature review, and that's what identified purpose and drafting the protocol do. But now we've entered the second stage of selection, which is the practical screen and the search for literature. And even though these are presented as two distinct steps, in practice they're really done together and interactively. However, it is necessary to think clearly about the practical screen before you start searching, because the practical screen will tell you what you're going to be searching for. However, after you start searching, especially if you do the pilot search, your initial search, then you might have to revise the practical screen accordingly. Maybe you find far too many studies, much more than you can handle, so you narrow the practical screen, you narrow your topic, or maybe you find far too few studies and you realize it's just maybe you only find two or three studies and you realize that's not enough to do a literature review, and therefore maybe you broaden your topic or whatever. Okay, so now this week we're covering the practical screen. Okay, so with the practical screen. So first, what is a practical screen? The practical screen is a set of decisions about which kind of studies to look for and which ones to not even look for. So the practicality is that there are thousands and thousands of academic studies on many topics, but if you're going to do a literature review, you cannot study everything. And the more popular your topic, the more studies there are, and the narrower is what you have to look at. I mean, this is just practicality. Ideally, you would study everything that has ever been done on your topic, but in practice, you can't do that. So we have to make decisions. Decisions about what our scope is. And on one hand, this could be a very brief topic, but if you are doing a theory mining review, that is, your goal is to build theory, then your decisions should not be arbitrary. You have to think carefully about your search strategy, your inclusion strategy, because that will determine, or that will affect to a large degree, the quality of your final product. Because if you make a decision that excludes certain things, then you might not find some studies that are very relevant to the theory you're trying to develop. Okay, so one important thing to note is that a practical screen is not a quality appraisal. In fact, quality appraisal is a later step that we will talk about. We have an entire week devoted to that. Quality appraisal is when you have your set of articles and you judge what is their quality, which ones are high quality, which ones are low quality, so that you have more confidence in the high quality ones and lower confidence in the results from the lower quality articles. A practical screen is not a quality appraisal. Because for quality appraisal, you actually read the studies or at least look over them and you make an evaluation of their quality. With a practical screen, you don't even look at the studies. You just say, I'm not going to even look at this. And so you can't say that it's high quality, low quality. And this has some implications because a lot of times people make practical screen decisions. For example, a common one that I'll talk about is say, I'm going to do a literature review and I will only look for the top journals, the highest quality academic journals. And when people do this, they mistakenly think this is a quality appraisal. They think because I'm looking only in the highest quality journals, I'm only looking at the highest quality articles. But that is a false assumption. Because just because a journal is on average high quality doesn't mean that every article in it is of such high quality. But more importantly, and much more seriously, there are many articles that are not in the so-called top journals that are of very high quality, and even regardless of quality, might be very relevant in their topic and treatment to what you're interested in. So that's why it's important to note from the outset that the practical screen is not talking about quality. There's a small aspect of that, but primarily it's not. It's just saying, I can't study everything. So where am I going to draw the line? What will I say I'm not going to look at just for practical concerns? And that's why it's called a practical screen. Okay. So in one of the articles I sent you at the beginning, actually both articles that I wrote talk about the practical screen, but from different perspectives. One of them talks about it from a more introductory way and pragmatic way. But the other article on theory mining reviews specifically looks at what decisions have implications for theory. If you're going to be building theory, what decisions do you need to make on the practical screen? And as you can see on the screen here, there's a lot of things to think about. And it looks very intimidating, overwhelming at first. But we're going to do an exercise in class after I finish the presentation. So the worksheet, you're going to apply all these criteria to your own topic, and we'll discuss as you do that. And you'll find as you do it, it's not that bad, because most of the criteria, you're going to end up saying no restriction. And when there's no restriction, then you're done with that topic. But some of them, you do have to make restrictions, and that's where you think about some more. Okay, so I'm going to go over all of these and emphasize what is a theoretical implication of each decision you make. So the first group of items is what types of articles should you include? I've already talked briefly about journal rankings, and the idea is there's so many journals out there on my topic. You know what? I like what we did last week, which unfortunately was not recorded. But I liked, as I was going through the topic, I had someone volunteer their topic, and I used their topic as an example. I think it makes things a little bit more practical. Could we do that again? Could someone please volunteer their topic? And provided it's a topic I know something about, I could use that as an example as I'm going through. So if you'd like to volunteer, I guess the first person who volunteers something in the chat window, I'll take it. Provided it's something I know about. If I don't really know about the topic, then I'll have to pick something else. Okay, Cloud Computer Framework for e-education. That's what we used last week. So I'll pick another one. The second one, the impact of critical human factors on project success in developing countries. So, Sean, what do you mean by critical human factors? I'm not quite sure what that means.
So, in the context, there are many ways that people can impact projects by the behavior, and not all of them carry the same weight. So, what I want to examine is some of the most impactful ones. So, those ones I call critical. So while the others may influence, the degree of the influence may not be that significant.
So what examples of these factors are you talking about?
For example, bias. So one may go in and, let's say you have an estimate for execution, and the estimate is, let's say, $100 million. But you may say, well, that's too much, and you force the number down, let's say, for whatever reason.
Okay, so that's bias. Can you give another example, please? So bias would be one human factor. Could you give another, please?
You also have risk, so excessive risk taking.
Okay, so matter of risk versus risk proclivity, proclivity or aversion as
Yeah.
another human factor. So we'll work with Sean's product topic. So the first topic for in the types of articles to include are journal rankings. So the restrictions. So for example, with project management, there's probably some studies that look at what are the top journals that publish project management research, and they might have maybe top 10, 15, or 20 journals. So if you find almost every major topic has that kind of study. Someone has done an academic study, which are the journals that most publish our type of research, and they have a ranking list of some sort. So a lot of people might say, okay, I want to do a literature review on the project management, some related project management topic like this. So I identify a study like this. They have 15 top journals. Those are the only journals that I search for my literature review because this study said these are the main project management ones. The problem with that is that, well, maybe those are the top, and no one is disputing that, but not all research is published in the top. And more importantly, the research that is most relevant to you might not be published in the top journal. It might be published in a national journal somewhere. It might be published in maybe also an international journal, but not one of the top ones. And so by saying you'll only look at the top journals, you're not looking elsewhere. And one very practical thing is that today, because we have electronic databases for searching, it's not that hard to search widely, to search lots of journals. So before, when people had to go through to their library and they only search the journals that are available in the library, okay, you could justify that. But today, when it's an electronic search, it's hard to justify searching only in top journals most of the time. The next topic, peer-reviewed versus gray literature. This one's a little bit controversial because most people will tell you, especially for doctoral students, when you're doing a literature review, you should only search for peer-reviewed literature. And just so that I don't assume everyone understands what peer-reviewed means, the standard way of scholarly publication is when you write an article and you submit it to the journal, the editor receives it, and they might read it or might just glance over it, but the editor will not make the decision to accept or not on their own. Rather, the editor will identify some experts on the topic. And sometimes the journal already has a long list of their editorial review board, people that read all the articles that come in, or sometimes they'll just look, or they might ask you to recommend an expert that has no conflict of interest with you, but they'll find experts on the topic to read the paper, usually at least two, sometimes up to three, who will read the article, and then they will give scholarly feedback and say, here are the strengths of the article, here are the weaknesses. Maybe these things need to be clarified, these things need to be corrected, or maybe this article is flawed, it does not follow proper methodology, and they might recommend rejection or might recommend acceptance, or more frequently they might recommend it to be revised before it's accepted. And then usually it goes back to the author who makes revisions, and sometimes then it goes back to those reviewers who read it again, give their comments again, and sometimes might go 2 rounds, maybe even up to 3, before the editor finally decides, based on the feedback of these experts, we accept this article, or based on their feedback, we reject this article. And so articles that have gone through that process mean that scholars who are experts on the topic, supposedly, have reviewed it and feel it is valid scientifically, is a scholarly valid contribution, and it has been corrected, and therefore it is published. So that's the peer review process. So gray literature is scholarly work that has not been through this peer review process. For example, someone has just written an article and no one has reviewed it, but it's still maybe published somewhere, or maybe they just post it on their website. And you look at it, it's a scholarly article, yes, but it hasn't been through this process for whatever reason. And most, I'll say 95% of literature reviews will only include peer-reviewed work. Because that actually is a type of quality appraisal. It means it's not just what the researchers thought, but some other scholars have looked at it and felt this is valid to some extent. It might not be perfect, it might still have quality flaws, but at least it has gone through some scholarly process of quality verification. And so most literature reviews will only include peer-reviewed work. And so most scholarly journals are peer-reviewed, most conferences are peer-reviewed. But there's other sources that are not. Some people might post things on their website. And now there's more and more very major databases or repositories that collect what is called gray literature that's not been peer-reviewed. And included in that might be books. Some scholars write books, and books usually do not go through this kind of rigorous peer review process. Some scholarly books do, most do not. And so a lot of researchers don't include books, results published in books, even scholarly books, in their reviews. So the thing here is that you need to consider this. Do you want to include gray literature that's not peer-reviewed, or do you want to restrict only to peer-reviewed? Personally, I feel that for theory, landscape, and reviews, that you're just seeing what is out there. And for theory contending reviews where you're making an argument, I feel it's okay that the work you include is not peer-reviewed. Because you're looking for ideas. You're looking for new ideas. And yeah, maybe someone has a very new idea, but it hasn't gone through the peer review process yet, and you don't want to exclude it. You think it's a very interesting idea, it extends the theory, and yes, it needs to go through refinement, but I think it's okay to include it and to make it part of your thinking. However, for a theory testing review that tests if theory that has gone through empirical research, what it's really saying, then it's usually a good idea. Well, it's controversial. There is an argument that if you're testing it, like studies that actually verify the theory, you want to make sure they've been peer-reviewed. So on one hand, there's an argument for that. On the other hand, there's something called publication bias. That's something that as researchers you need to be aware of, and that is that especially if you're doing this, especially for quantitative research. So if you're doing statistical analysis, so you might test a hypothesis, and your results might be statistically significant, or they might be statistically non-significant. Maybe your sample size is too small to get statistical significance, or maybe the phenomenon you're testing just does not exist. So your result is there's low effect size, low statistical significance. Journals like to report new results, new knowledge. And when you say you've done a test and the result was inconclusive, or said, no, this new idea you had was not supported, a lot of journals will reject it. They said, we don't want to report that. We want our journal to publish new, verified information. We don't want to, even if you've done a test and the result is, no, our theory was not valid, the journal said that's not exciting. We don't want to publish that. For a theory testing review, such as a meta-analysis, you want to hear the bad news also. You're trying to see that, is everything good news? Is the theory always verified? Are there some times when people have tested the same thing and it was not verified? You want to know about that. But because a lot of journals don't like to publish that kind of thing, then a lot of that is never published. but for theory, test, and review, you would like to know about that. And so if you can find out about it, and there's different ways to find out about it. You might email authors to tell you about it. Again, there are some websites. Actually, let me show you one. The one that, so that it's more concrete what I'm talking about. The biggest gray literature website is SSRN, which stands for Social Science Research Network. And so here, so just for examples, so we're talking about, let's see if we can do a search. We're looking for human factors in project management. Okay, so like here you find articles like someone from Virtual University of Pakistan, project management, factors critical for success of projects in oil and gas sector of Kuwait, then key success factors in software development projects. Then here, integrating approaches to privacy action. Let's see some that are more on topic. Project management career path, a case study in a project-based telecommunication company. Now, these articles here, the vast majority of these are not published in any journal or even in a conference. Some of them are, like this one tells you it's published in an international conference. This one here is Duke Law Journal. Okay, so it's published in a law journal. But most of them that don't have anything, or quite a lot of them, are not published in any journal or article. But the author at least is making them available on the web so that people who are interested in the work they've done but it's not published can have access to it. So I publish a lot of my work on here before it's published. So for example, I sent you two articles, the systematic literature review paper, the one with the 8 steps, that's this one here. I published it on SSRN in 2010, and a lot of people have been reading it, have been citing it, and it's only now 2015 that I finished revising it and I'm getting it published in an actual journal. But people have been reading it for years before then. So that's why a lot of researchers like to get their work out there even while it's still in progress. So we're talking about, do you include that kind of stuff or not? I think a lot of times it is useful to include. Okay, so those are the issues with gray literature. The next, conference articles. Okay, traditionally, and when I say traditionally, I'm talking about as recently as 10 years ago, people did not usually include conference articles in literature reviews, and it was mainly a pragmatic issue. There's so many conferences, how do you access them? Most conferences did not have their articles indexed in electronic journals, in electronic databases. Most of the time, the only way to access conference articles was to get the conference proceedings of each conference. And there's so many conferences, and each of those conferences has a new conference each year. Is just way too much. So it was not. So a lot of times people would just search for journal articles and not conference articles. But the situation is changing. Now more and more conferences, especially the higher quality ones, are indexed electronically. And so by searching, you can also find conference articles. And because of that, when it is available, it's advisable to include conference articles in your search. But even now, conference articles are not as widely cited or indexed as journal articles, so it's just harder to reach them. One reason that's important to note that they're not as widely indexed is that in some academic fields, not all, the idea of a conference article is that a conference article is a first refined draft of your study. And it's a shorter, refined draft. and you get feedback, you present at a conference, they give you more feedback, and then finally you revise it, you extend it, and the final version goes to the journal. So the idea is that a conference article is just a first draft. So why include the conference article in your review when it's just a first draft? The journal article is the final refined version. So that's one part of the thinking. And that is still true in a lot of cases. In my field, information systems, that is usually the case, that conference articles are first drafts for your eventual journal article. And so if you only include journal articles, you leave out conference articles, you're not missing that much new knowledge. But it's not true in all fields. I can't say for all of your different academic disciplines because it varies, though I know a lot of them are like what I described in information systems. But in some fields, like my research overlaps with computer science to quite a degree. And in computer science, in some fields of computer science, not all, it's quite different. Some conferences are considered very high quality, in fact, more important than journals, and where people publish the final version in a conference. So it's important to know the practice in your academic discipline. And for that, you just ask scholars, professors in your discipline, and they'll tell you this. Like, are conference articles usually the final version, or they're just first drafts, or they're refined drafts, which will eventually be published in journal articles? And so that has implications for how important it is for you to try to index conference articles or not. However, that said, so in computer science, this is the case. But because that's the case in computer science does a very good job in indexing conference articles because they realize how important they are to the field. And most of the major conferences and even a lot of the minor ones are indexed in electronic databases that are very easy to access in computer science. So if that's the case in your field, likely it's easy to access them. Okay, with all of that, there's one major caveat. So I said, so in an academic field like mine, in information systems, where conference articles are first refined drafts and eventually they get into journal articles, the problem is that if you're really looking broadly to get all the ideas, everything people have done, you can't depend on that very much for two reasons. One is that there are some articles that people publish in conferences, but they never go ahead and finish them up for a journal. The researcher, for whatever reason, maybe lost interest or did not have new data to add, or for whatever reason, the conference article is the end. But maybe you are interested in that topic if you only knew about it. So you can't just assume that. A second reason is that in some research fields, definitely mine, information systems, it takes some time between the conference article to be published, then the person extends it, maybe collects more data, does revisions, submits the journal article, then the peer review process can take, in my field, it's taking 1 year is quite normal for peer review, between when you submit the article to a journal and when it's eventually published. 1 year is very normal. Less than 6 months almost never happens. Sometimes 2 years. So the point being that if you want the latest information, it's probably in conferences, not in the journal articles. So so at least look for conference articles in the last 2 or so years. So these are considerations in whether to include conference articles or not. In general, I recommend try your best to do that. Then The last kind of question on the type of article to include is practitioner publications. And this one is probably the most controversial because scholarly literature reviews usually do not like to include practitioner publications. Practitioner publications, I mean articles that are written by non-scholars. Articles that are like if you're in project management, maybe a project manager wrote, from my personal experience, here is my top 5 list of things to take care of in human factors in managing people issues in projects. Okay, so some project manager that thinks he has a lot of experience wrote these ideas. Is that relevant to your scholarly study? Most of the time, the traditional thinking is no, it's not relevant. And so where did they publish it? Maybe they published it in Project Management Institute magazine. Or maybe they just published on their blog posts, on their blog on the web. Are you going to include that in your literature review? If you include that, where do you stop? You just search the web and anything you find, you just include in your literature review? So it's a very messy area you're entering into. However, I recommend at least look for what's out there, because practitioners are people who are in the field. They're people that are doing things day to day. They have experience, they have new insights that scholars often will never have. And so I think it is worthwhile, take a look at what the practitioners are saying. You can get a lot of good ideas from them. Now, of course, if you do find ideas from practitioners, you have to cite it, just like any scholarly article. So it's not saying that you just get ideas from them because it's not scholarly, you don't cite it. No, you have to cite it because it's their idea. But from my perspective, it's okay to include practitioner publications, at least for theory, landscaping reviews, like you'll probably be doing in this course, and theory contending reviews. However, for theory testing reviews, again, a theory testing review only includes articles that have actually tested a theory. Practitioners don't test theory. And if they do it very badly because they're not trained in scholarly methods of building or testing theory. So for theory testing review, no. You don't want to include practitioner publications there. But for theory, landscaping reviews where you're just seeing what is out there theoretically, what the scholars have out there, borrow ideas from practitioners. It's okay, and you might get some really helpful insights. You might find someone who has experience and really good ideas that no scholar has thought about. So that's my recommendation there. I'll go to next screen. Okay, the topic of the study. So this is another practical screen criteria. Subject databases, and that is where should you search. So of course in this case where now usually an academic researcher, you have access through your university to various subject databases, and you search on what they have. So next week we'll go into this in much more detail. The point here is that there are sometimes you have a choice of subject databases. EBSCO is a very common one, but EBSCO doesn't have everything. So, for example, in my field, information systems is using IT in organizations, especially in businesses. So EBSCO has its business database, which has a lot of our articles, a lot of relevant articles. But information systems, because it's related to IT, has a lot in common with computer science. And so there's a lot of research that I would be interested in that is related to computer science. And that might not be in EBSCO. So there's another database, the ACM Digital Library, that has almost all computer science journals linked there. And so I would need to search in EBSCO and also in ACM Digital Library. The point is, depending on your subject, So like for project management, yes, definitely EBSCO Business Library would be very good. But then there's also ProQuest has one called ABI Inform, which is also a business focused database, but they don't have exactly the same things. They have a lot of overlap, but they have some journals that are not in the others. So it's a good idea to search in both of them if you have access to both. Fortunately, you can't search in what you don't have access to, so that'll be a limiting factor. But the main point here is don't search in just one database and think that that's enough. Search in as many as might be relevant that you have access to. And Google Scholar is free, so I'll tell you how to use that to enhance what you're doing and also talk about its limitations where it's not enough. Okay. Then next topic, related to the topic of your study is the content. And this one should be fairly evident that you will search mainly using keywords on the topics and concepts that match your research question. So you're not going to search. So like if you're looking for human factors, critical human factors for project management, you're not only going to search for project management, because that will come up with like let's just do Google search here. So if you just do project management in Google, 4,850,000 results. But if you look at human factors in project management, okay, only 3.68 million results. You have fewer results. Google, because Google Scholar is still Google, so you have all kinds of results. It's like ridiculous the number of results you have, and a lot of them are not relevant at all. So that's one limitation of Google Scholar. It will always give you way too much information. It's not good for restricting information. But my point is that your search is going to be restricted to what you're interested in. You're not going to search broader than your interests. Okay. Okay, so the next group of things to consider are the nature of empirical studies. Empirical means data. So studies that actually collect and analyze data. So it is the first thing is, do you only want to look at empirical studies, studies that actually collected data, or do you want to include conceptual studies, studies that just talk about ideas? People read things, they have their ideas, they make their arguments, but there's no data collection. They didn't actually do any interviews, they didn't do any surveys. It's just their scholarly thinking. So do you want to include both, or do you want to say only empirical studies that collected data? So theory landscaping reviews and theory contending reviews should include conceptual studies. You should not restrict yourself to only articles that collected data, because a lot of times conceptual studies are where people are thinking about the ideas. They haven't tested the idea, but they're thinking about it. And very often, or I'll say normally, a conceptual study is held to higher standards of scholarly rigor than an empirical study. Because if you have data, then the data supports your argument. But if you don't have data, then your argument had better be really strong in order for your work to be published. And so a lot of conceptual studies are very carefully thought through, because without that, they would not be published. So for theory landscaping reviews and theory contending reviews that are making theoretical arguments, it's a good idea to include conceptual studies. However, theory testing reviews, where you're trying to find out, when people have tested this theory, what did they find? Was it supported or not supported, and why? Well, you can't do that with studies that did not test the theory. You can only include studies that actually collected data and analyze it to test the theory. So by definition, it only includes empirical studies. Okay, so the study setting is, yeah, what is the context? So this is where the developing country thing comes in. Where are you going to restrict your theory just to developing countries, or it's going to be more general than that? And again, I want you to really don't think just in terms of developing versus developed countries. Think about what characteristics of these countries would be relevant to the theory. So yeah, maybe it's the political context. Maybe it's the economic context. Maybe when people don't have such high salaries, it's a different. So like human factors. As I said, I don't know off the bat why human factors and project management would be different between developing countries and developed countries. Maybe they are. And so, Sean, you have to explicate that, but you have to be very clear. But you need to be really careful. And even if, let's assume that you are going to say that that you do have a strong argument why this only applies in developing countries. Well, you should probably include developed countries in your search as well. Because when you include developed countries, then you can find what studies have people done in developed countries, and you can look at those results and see, well, these results might also apply in developing countries, but some other results might not apply. And you have your reason for saying that. But if you don't even know what people have studied in developed countries, then how do you know if it applies or not in developing countries? So even if you're, it's okay to search wider than your study setting, just to see what is out there. Even if your theory is going to be based on just a limited context. Because that will be very important for you to argue why your theory is bounded for theoretical reasons, not just data collection reasons, but for theoretical reasons why it applies in certain settings and not in other settings. To do that, you have to understand the other settings to be able to say why your theory does not apply there. Okay?
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I was trying not to be overly ambitious. So I'm thinking about how to draw some realistic boundaries. But thanks for that. I'll reframe the initial scope of inquiry.
Okay. And again, as you're doing that, it's very good to be quite sensitive. Because when you eventually do test your theory, you collect your data. Sean, which country are you in?
I'm in the US now.
Okay. So where would you actually collect your data?
So I am looking for, well, aspirationally, I would want to work in areas that would benefit the most.
Okay.
So I'm tending towards the sub-Saharan Africa because I think that would be a huge benefit in terms of economic
that's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine that you're in the U.S., you develop a general theory, and you collect your data in developing countries so that you can easily apply it there. No problem. No problem at all. And I that's wonderful. So that you're thinking of actually applying your results where it's most beneficial. Wonderful. But again, that should not limit your theory. Your theory should be more broad. And then you could explain the limitations of your data collection, saying that even though you think your theory is broad, you've only tested it so far in these developing countries. And because you've read other studies that give you an indication that maybe there would be differences in developed countries, you can say that as a limitation. But that doesn't fundamentally change your theory, because that way people who are interested in developed country context can still learn from your study. Because your study is not saying it's only for developing countries. And if you're really contributing to knowledge, it probably is not. And in past sessions, I've said, you all should really have confidence in yourselves. that you are able to contribute to international knowledge, not just to the knowledge in your country or in your region. So to have that boldness, again, even if you can only collect data in your region, have the boldness that your findings, your results are widely applicable. Okay. Then the next topic is participants or subjects, and that is who are you actually. So when you're collecting data, you're doing your literature review. Are you only looking at studies that did certain kinds of people? Okay, so an example is human factors in project management. Perhaps you are only interested in the project manager's perspective. So you're only looking for studies that looked at the project manager's perspective. You're not looking at studies that looked at the project member's perspective. Another example here is, okay, maybe you're looking for, okay, project management members, and you're looking at human factors that affect the success of the project. You start doing your search and you find, wow, there's a lot of empirical research, but most of these studies, or a lot of these studies, there were students who were taking a project management class, and their professor did a little study to see what are the factors that affected these students successfully completing their project in the course. And you're saying, wait a minute, I want real workers. I don't want students. Because student projects are completely different from real organizational projects. It's an artificial situation, so on. So you might say your theory applies to real people, real working people. You're not interested in tests of students. So that's an example of where you place a restriction on the primary studies. You're only looking at real working people. You're not looking at students. And this student example is actually a very big issue. There's a lot of controversy because a lot of professors do studies on their students because it's easy. They're there. You can give them course credit. They'll participate and everything. But how valid is the knowledge that you get from that? I mean, I've done it. I'm actually doing a project with that, but it's a controversial issue, but you need to think about that. Do you want to include, and this is especially for empirical studies, especially if you're doing a theory testing review, but even if you're doing others review, like theory contending review, are you going to give much weight to studies that use students? So these are things to consider. So programs intervention, this mainly refers to empirical studies that do statistical analysis, because a lot of them do experiments, and it's so the thing is that what kind of intervention is being tested. So one practical one that often comes in is like if you're looking at survey research that was done using surveys. Sometimes you want to look at articles that have done survey collection. But depending on your study, so for instance, maybe you're looking at a study of like what human factors have affected the success or failure of this project. You might realize there's two different ways of measuring that. Maybe there are some studies that collected survey data, that basically gave surveys to the project members and asked them about their different human factors and so on, asked them about their characteristics in relation to the project. And so, and that's how it collects the data to do the analysis. But that is called self-reported data. So the person is reporting information for themselves. And as we know, people normally think better of themselves and more highly of themselves than others might. And so maybe some other studies, maybe the researcher was actually present during the project and made observations, and the researcher took notes and made their assessment of how people participated. Or maybe they used a project manager as someone who rated each person's participation, each person's human factors. And so this way, the measurement is done in different ways, and so there's different kind of biases involved. So you might say that I only want objective measures. When people reported about themselves, I don't want to include that kind of study. I want studies where there's some objectivity between the person who was evaluating the human factors versus the person who was evaluating it versus them doing it themselves. So that would be an example of this program intervention or means of data collection being a practical screen criterion. Okay, so next, research design. So research design, are you doing survey research, experimental research? Are you doing interviews, case studies? So the point here is that there's very few justifications to restrict it. Like some might say, okay, I want to do only survey research. I'm looking at primary studies that did survey research or that did experiments. But if someone did a case study, I'm not interested in that. People do have their preferences, not just people, but different disciplines have their preferences of what kind of research procedures are considered more rigorous, more appropriate. But if you're trying to build theory, one of the things you have to understand, there are many different valid ways of doing research. And it's really, if you're saying you just reject one type of research off the bat, you're going to miss a lot of good ideas that are different from what you're thinking. You're going to have a very narrow way of thinking, and you're not going to come up with new, important, valuable insights. One caveat to that is, and related to the next point on quantitative versus qualitative studies, not exactly the same thing as research design, but closely related. So quantitative studies are studies that do mathematical or statistical analysis, versus qualitative studies is where you're looking at text, you're maybe interviews, and you're just both of them are empirical. Qualitative, you do collect data, but the data is like interviews, observation, maybe even video, and then the researcher interprets these things and tells some sort of story out of it. So the question of are you going to include quantitative or qualitative, it really depends on the kind of synthesis you're going to do. There's some kinds of synthesis that only work with quantitative research. Others can accept both kinds. So it depends. If you use a method, and there's pros and cons, so when we get to the synthesis chapter, we'll talk about these different kinds of ways of doing synthesis, but that will determine whether you accept all kinds of studies or you say only quantitative, only statistical analysis, or even only qualitative studies. Then another matter is the source of financial support. So this idea comes mainly from medical research, where sometimes the researcher is paid by someone. It's paid by a company, paid by an organization to do this research. And if they're paid to do this research, typically their results will show that organization in a more positive light, or the results would more likely say what that organization wants them to say. Unfortunately, in medical research, this is a big issue. That especially in drug research, like, does this new drug work or not? As we probably all know, the drug industry is huge, corrupt, makes a lot of money, and they do pay people to do research that says their drug works, so that people will use their medication. So it's a very big issue that people who do that kind of research are required to say, I was financially supported by this organization. And if they hide that, then that's a huge ethical violation. But if they report that, then the researcher would decide, am I going to include such studies that are probably biased? So it's not such an issue in other fields, but in business research, so I am in business, so IT use in business, and project management is often a business topic. Research ethics requires that if the researcher is paid by an organization that somehow benefits from the results of the researcher has to declare that. Not all researchers are sufficiently ethical to declare it, but hopefully most are. So if someone declares that, you might want to consider, do you want to include that or not? And I recommend you still include it, but you should definitely put a big question mark on their results, realizing it might be biased. Okay. Any questions about the issues raised in this slide before we go on? Okay, so we'll go on then. Okay, the last set of criteria, and this one is the last set of criteria to consider in your practical screen are there's 3 bibliographic characteristics of the articles. One is, first of all, the dates. Do you want to restrict the range of dates? And in my view, generally speaking, if you're trying to build theory, I don't see much reason why you would restrict dates. People do. For example, some might say that, okay, I'm just making this up. Maybe formal project management techniques really became prevalent since 1990, and so I'm only going to research articles from 1990 up till now. And in the bibliographic search, you restrict dates from 1990 up to now. Okay, maybe the phenomenon you're looking at only started recently, but maybe people have been studying something similar under another name, or they have had ideas that are not directly related but contributed to what you're doing. If you're looking for new theoretical ideas, I feel just search everything available and see what you come up with. Now, if you sometimes depending on the topic. For instance, I was working with a doctoral student who was studying online education, online education, and so as part of his searches, he was including distance education. But he says he's only interested in online education using the internet, and the internet only became widespread from 1993. So I think he did a restriction on his search till 1990. Because if you look for distance education before 1990, well, there's been distance education for I don't know how long, maybe 80 years. People did education by mail, maybe education by television. There's all kinds of distance education, and there was research on that. But that's not what he was interested in. He was only interested in the distance education on the internet. So by putting a date restriction from the phenomenon, that excluded articles that definitely were not relevant. So there might be reasons for that. But you have to make sure you have a very good reason for restricting your dates. That said, the end date is today, whatever today is. So it's important when you write your report to specify the dates that you did the search, so that when someone looks at the article, they know, because like maybe you do your search here in 2015, maybe the article is eventually published in 2016 or 2017. Well, someone reading it, a 2017 article, wants to know, well, the search you actually did ended at 2015. So it's important to state the date that your search ended for the sake of other researchers. The next item is publication language. The reality today, whether we like it or not, is that English is the number one scholarly language in the world today. Maybe in 20 years later, it'll be a different language. But for now and for the last 50 years, it's been English. And so, if you are looking for the leading, most insightful scholarly insights, you have to search English language databases. That said, I highly recommend also search other languages. So if you know another language, like French maybe, search a French database in addition to English. Because not all scholarly research and not all good scholarly research is done in English only. It's also done in other languages. So I'm not saying search only in English, I'm saying search at least in English. So for those of us for whom English is our primary language, that's obvious. But for those who have other languages in which people do scholarly work and who have access to those databases, like French databases, also search those. But the main point is do not only search like French, because you're going to miss most of the leading work. Because scholars in non-English speaking countries, I mean, high quality scholars publish in English because they want their articles to be widely read. So that's why I say that. That said, this is not saying, and I'm not saying at all that you have to write your article in English. So I know like some people in the class are francophone. It's perfectly fine to write your article in French. But I'm just saying, but you have to search for literature in English. And you can write your article in French. That's a whole other question. What language do you want to write your article in? So that's a matter of who do you want to read your article. So that's another question. That's not what I'm talking about at all. I'm just saying the articles you search for have to be in English. And if you know other languages too, with scholarly databases, search in those ones as well. The last item is this is relatively rare, but some literature reviews only search for works of some popular leading authors. If you're trying to build theory, there's really no reason you would do that. You're not looking for authors, you're looking for ideas. So there's not much more I'll say on that, because it's a fairly rare thing, but it is an item out there, so just for completeness I mention it. Okay. So, any other questions here before going to the next... We're almost finished with the slides, and then we'll get into some more practical tips. But any questions on what we've looked over this far?
No, not so far.
Okay. Okay then. So now, moving into more practical tips. So some practical tips for the practical screen. So how do you actually go about it? Now the practical screen it interacts very much with a literature search. You have to do your practical screen criteria first. You have to know what you're going to look for before you start searching. But then how you apply it. So after you do the search, and again next week we'll talk in detail on how to do the search. So after you do the search, you're going to get a lot of articles. And you first of all, you just collect. You collect. Then you read the titles and the abstracts. Just the titles and the abstract. To determine whether or not they match your criteria in the practical screen or not. Okay? So in doing that... in reading your title and the abstract, you get a feel, does it match this criteria or not? Sometimes it's not enough to read the abstract. You might need to go to the full text to understand what is this article really talking about. Then in those cases, you refer to the full text. If the abstract is not very clear about a yes or no, do you include it? Then for articles I decide, no, this is not relevant, don't delete them. rather, in your reference management software, just create folders for excluded articles that say, okay, this article is excluded, and here's why I'm excluding it. Let me show you an example from a literature review I did. So I had, I've already started showing you this. I'll put it up on the screen. So one of the projects I've been doing for a number of years now is a literature review on scholarly research on Wikipedia, about Wikipedia, the online encyclopedia. And so I mainly had two doctoral students, there's research assistants, one's Mohammed, one's Mustafa. And so this is Zotero. And one nice thing about Zotero, there's an online sharing version, so we could all work from the same database from our different computers. So here are all the databases that they searched. So you can see, yeah, we actually searched a lot of different databases that we have access to. And here are all the articles that they found from the different databases. So this is what Mustafa found. This is what Mohammed found. Then each of them went through the articles. After finding them, they went through each article, reading the title and abstract. And then, so they did them separately. One of them did A to L, the other did M to Z. And here are the articles they excluded. So, for example, the A to L articles are here. Then here, these ones were excluded because, okay, that's a category. Okay, none were here, but in our review, we said we're not going to include any books. So there's no books, so none in that category. We decided we would not include conferences. There's reasons for that I don't want to get into. But we decided we would not include conference articles. So articles that were conferences that were found were put in here. Then we included doctoral theses, so doctoral dissertations, but non-doctoral theses, like a master's student thesis, we did not include. So we said, okay, that's why this one is excluded. Then we decided we would not include work that was not peer-reviewed, so that was the case. And then finally, here are some articles that they mentioned Wikipedia, it came up, but when they looked at it, really that article was not about Wikipedia, so it's excluded there. So that's an example of what I mean. That so going through all the articles, so going through all the articles, reading the abstract and the titles and so on, they eventually found that, okay, some of them do not apply, and so they put them in these different categories, excluded categories. And the advantage, instead of just deleting them, is that someone can then go over and double check and verify, okay, is this really... So yeah, here's an example of non-English. So there are some articles that were not written in English, and so the person could not read them. This one's in French, this one is Portuguese, so they couldn't read them, and so since you can read them, sorry, couldn't include them in the review. Okay, so the point is that someone else can go over and verify, okay, do we really want to exclude this? And so that way, that enhances the team aspect of the research. Okay, and it also allows for inter-rater reliability. You can calculate how many articles did the two reviewers agree on, how many did they disagree on, and so on. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this presentation.